Hi, I'm Megan Grebner, Indiana Farm Director for Brownfield Ag News. And while there have been tons of campaigns and tons of talk about those presidential candidates, we're going to talk tonight a little bit about the ag issues and what some of the big things we need to focus on in the ag industry is watching during all of these campaigns, both on the Republican, Democrat, and Democratic sides. With us this evening is Kay Henderson, News Director for Radio Iowa. Good evening, Kay.
Good evening.
Well, we can't see you. We can definitely hear you. So
Good.
Let's start first a little bit about the feel of the campaign and the issues that are being talked about right now in Iowa. And we can start with just broad issues as the Iowa caucus nears.
Well, really the 4 ag issues that come up most frequently on the campaign trail here are: number 1, the ethanol production mandate, the RFS. Number 2, farm subsidies. It's a particular interest among Republican voters. And 3, the waters of the U.S. rule that has been talked about in Washington, D.C. It's obviously being talked about by Iowa farmers, and it's being discussed on the Iowa campaign trail. The 4th ag-related issue is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There are some candidates who make the contention that it could expand ag trade, but most of the discussion about the partnership is a negative from the Republican candidates. They don't like the way it was negotiated. Some of them say they'd tear it up on their first day in office. So it's not very closely focused on the ag subsidy idea. I actually had a conversation with Rick Santorum this past week, who said he can clearly see the advantages it would yield to farmers in Iowa and the rest of the country if it were to pass. He just has some grave concerns about other parts of the accord.
When we look at those issues, in the ag issues in general, do candidates have a pretty good grasp of them, especially when you look at the voters and the fact that agriculture really is such a small percentage of the U.S. population in general?
Well, I think I'll let the Iowa voters give you sort of a measurement about whether they think the candidates are in tune with ag issues. I will say that even when candidates are in forums in rural areas, the majority of the questions that they get have nothing to do specifically with agriculture. I remember covering Scott Walker. If you don't remember, he at one time was running for president in a small venue in Greenfield, Iowa, and there was someone there from the Renewable fuels community who was there specifically to ask a question about the ethanol mandate. But it was the only question that was specifically focused on that issue in an area where the majority of the people either had an interest in agriculture, or were, first generation off the farm, or were working in an industry that had some relationship to agriculture. And then after the forum was over, I chatted with this gentleman who'd asked the question about specifically the ethanol issue. And he said it wouldn't be his number 1 issue when he went to choose whom to support on caucus night. So the candidates aren't really confronted with Iowans who say, hey, this is a make or break issue for me.
You mentioned some of those other issues. The renewable fuel standard is one I think that's probably gotten a lot, I would assume has gotten a lot of play the last couple of weeks, and will on the ag side of things heading into the caucus. Are there any candidates' positions that we should be watching? I know it seems that Ted Cruz has been followed and talked about his position on ethanol. Any others?
Well, as you referenced, the ethanol issue has become a bit combustible, if you will, on the political front this week. But it's really been talked about since last spring. Bruce Rastetter, who's a well-known in Iowa agribusinessman, he at one time had an interest in an ethanol production facility, hosted a forum at which most of the Republican candidates spoke. And after that was over, the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association came up with what they frankly referred to as their naughty and nice list. And there are two candidates among all of the candidates running both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, only two candidates who are on their naughty list, and that would be Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. And then you sort of referred to what happened this past week, and I'll just maybe walk you through that if you'd like. But the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association had a summit in Iowa at which many of the candidates spoke, and it was also an event attended by Iowa Governor Terry Branstad. After he got off the stage where he had addressed the people attending the summit, he went off into this little side room where he talked to me and a small group of other Iowa reporters, and he was becoming animated, and one of the reporters said, "Do you want to see Ted Cruz defeated because of his stand on the ethanol issue?" And Branstad's one-word response was yes. Well, that created a huge firestorm. Steve King, who's a congressman from Iowa, he represents the northwest quadrant of the state, and coincidentally, it's the congressional district in the country that produces more ethanol than any other congressional district in the country. He's actually endorsed Ted Cruz, considers himself and presents himself to voters. Steve King does, that is, as an ethanol champion. And he also sort of got a little animated after he heard about what Governor Branstad said, and he called that sort of a de facto endorsement of Donald Trump. Now, fast forward a couple of hours after this whole Steve King, Terry Branstad thing happens, and who shows up at the Ag Summit but Donald Trump? And he was beaming as he referred to Terry Branstad's statement about Ted Cruz. So it's been a really interesting week in Iowa politics. The other sort of undercurrent here is the aforementioned Congressman Steve King has a son who works for a super PAC supporting Ted Cruz, and also the aforementioned Terry Branstad has a son who works for a super PAC called the America's Renewable Future. That is a group, as you might suspect by the America's Renewable Future name, that is heavily lobbying on behalf of the Renewable Fuel Standard. They have been sending mailers out to rural Iowans like you wouldn't believe. That would be a phrase that Donald Trump would use, like you wouldn't believe. Some of them have huge letters that say danger and Ted Cruz's name on them. And so this has become a real point of sort of, I've referred to it on our air as a Republican family feud over fuel. So it has kind of erupted this week.
I guess that leads to my next question is, regardless of party, can Iowa be won without supporting the renewable fuel standard? It seems like that is the biggest ag issue that's being discussed in reference to Iowa.
Well, that is the fear that Terry Branstad was expressing, because the polls now show that Ted Cruz is in a position in this field of 12 Republican candidates to be the one who rides out of Iowa on the night of February 1st in the #1 position. And his concern is that for the first time since the Iowa caucuses came into prominence in the 1970s, that Iowa will be sending off to New Hampshire's primary someone who doesn't support the renewable fuel standard. You know, going back, a person by the name of John McCain came to Iowa just briefly in 2000 and said, I don't like the renewable fuel standard. He didn't do too well. In 2008, in the Iowa caucuses, he essentially tied for third with Fred Thompson, but the tally shows that he was in the 4th position. He wound up winning the Republican nomination. Also in 2012, we had a candidate named Tim Pawlenty. He is now the former governor of Minnesota, who called for phasing out the renewable fuel standard. But, you know, Tim Pawlenty had to phase out his own campaign before he even got to the caucuses because he lost something we call the Iowa straw poll here. So the history of the Iowa caucuses is that I guess the idea behind ag interests is that they can bring up issues that are important, issues that might never get discussed on a national stage were it not for the position of Iowa's caucuses being the first contest in the presidential selection process.
One other topic you brought up that's being discussed is waters of the U.S. Farmers around the country continue to be concerned about regulatory overreach. As you listen to debates, stump speeches, things around the state, how much is that coming into play on the Republican side and the Democrat side?
It's not discussed on the Democratic side at all. It's not brought up by the Iowans who attend their events. It is discussed among the Republican candidates, and it is brought up during conversation. In fact, Carly Fiorina, the former Hewlett-Packard CEO who's running for president, was speaking at this Renewable Fuels Summit this past week, and her largest crowd response was her utter rejection of the waters of the U.S. rule. There's also something else roiling in Iowa that people in other parts of the country may know about. The Des Moines Water Works, which is the water utility for the largest metropolitan area in Iowa, is suing 4 northwest Iowa counties, the officials in their counties, alleging that they have mismanaged the drainage districts in those counties, and it has polluted the drinking water in Des Moines with nitrates, and they have to run nitrate removal equipment for record amounts of time in the last several years, raising water utility rates in the capital city and surrounding suburbs by a significant amount. That is now a lawsuit that's in the court system, and it occasionally gets referenced by the presidential candidates in relationship to this idea that there is regulatory overreach on the part of the Obama administration and courts in general tying the hands of producers up with lawsuits and those sorts of things.
One last question, and we appreciate your time this evening, Kay.
Oh, sure.
As we look at the election cycles, has there been a decline in focus of agriculture over the years, or does it maybe get more attention, like you referenced earlier, because you're in Iowa and it's an opportunity because of the makeup of the state, which is, I would compare to Indiana, where agriculture plays in a role to the state's economy. It gets a little bit more highlight and more attention because it's Iowa.
Well, the first caucus campaign I covered was in 1988. Radio Iowa started on July 1st of 1987, and that was sort of right smack dab in the middle of that caucus campaign as the candidates were competing for support here. And it was right in the midst of the farm crisis. And so you had candidates talking about, bank closings. You had candidates talking about moratoriums on farm foreclosures. And in 1988, in the general election, Iowa was actually one of the few states that in 1984 rather, was one of the states that Ronald Reagan lost because of the farm issue, and people were so exercised about how they felt their federal government and the lending agencies that are, quasi-governmental entities were, foreclosing on farmers and creating real hardship in farm country. So it was a prominent issue in the 1988 campaign, and it's one of the reasons why Missouri Congressman Richard Gephardt was able to win the Iowa caucuses in 1988, and also a reason why a guy named Jesse Jackson finished third, because he was a populist out talking about the hurt in farm country. So over the years, it's been more about the economics of farming than about the romance of it. But now you have on the Democratic side, you have a candidate in Bernie Sanders who's talking about, you know, conglomerates, you know, monopolies, and he does talk about agriculture in a way that is a bit reminiscent about the stuff that I heard about in the 1980s.
It definitely sounds like things will be continue to heat up over the next 10, 11 days before the...
Which would be great, because I think it's 14 degrees here.
Any closing comments, thoughts before we let you go this evening?
Well, Iowans are hardy souls. The caucuses are a strange creature. You have to go to a precinct caucus. Some of these will actually be in somebody's living room. There will be more than 1,600 of them on the Republican side and more than 1,600 of them on the Democratic side. You have to go at a set time. It's not a day-long voting extravaganza. You have to go and be there by 7 o'clock or you can't participate. And then you have to sit around, and it's kind of an organizational meeting, and you have to wade through that. And then you get to, on the Democratic side, do this weird thing where you literally stand up for your candidate. You go on one side of the room and stand there, and they do math, and they determine if all the candidates are viable, and if you have an unviable candidate, and that means you don't have 15% support in the room. That means no one in the room can support that candidate. They have to go to another. So it's an interesting tradition. On the Republican side, it's much easier. They give you a piece of paper and you get to mark an X by the candidate you support. But it does provide sort of the first real focus group testing of the presidential campaign about which candidate's message is resonating. And, you know, on February 2nd, there are probably going to be candidates who will be former 2016 presidential candidates.
Well, as a girl that loves politics, I can't wait to watch the Iowa caucus, and I will tell you one of my bucket list items is to someday be able to witness the caucus process for myself, firsthand.
Come on over.
I will definitely have to take you up on that one of these days. Kay, thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.